So we're just about done with the NCAA championships this year. All that's left is the finals, and by the time this video is out, the finals will probably be done as well. So what I wanted to do is go back and look at the All-Americans in every weight class and see which of the top 8 seeds ended up falling out and which of the guys who were seeded 9 through 33 ended up making their way in. So I'll just go weight class by weight class. At 125, there's only one person who was seeded outside of the top 8 that made it in, and one person who was seeded inside who didn't make it. So this weight class, surprisingly, pretty much was all chalk all the way through. So after the first round, all the top 16 seeds won. Moving into the next round, all the top 8 seeds won. The only upset in this quarterfinals was Mueller over Bresser, and then we started to see a couple upsets in the semis with Mueller over Rivera and then Lee over Piccinini. But then in the wrestlebacks, after Sean Russell fell to Spencer Lee, he had to work his way back in and had to deal with Rayvon Foley. And unfortunately for him, he wasn't able to get the win there. So we have this match right here between Rayvon Foley and Sean Russell, the 9 seed versus the 6 seed, and the 9 seed Rayvon Foley ended up winning by major decision, 12-4 to get in as an All-American. So Russell ends up not AAing despite his seed, and Foley ends up being an AA despite his seed. At 133, this one was a lot wilder. This of all the weight classes, this one, I guess this wasn't the biggest. This is actually only just one of them. But Mickey Philippi had some high expectations. He had a win over Dayton Fix previously, so people thought he'd go pretty far here. Ends up winning a very close match against Austin Gomez. A couple opportunities, especially in the second period, for Gomez to score a takedown. Wasn't able to. Ends up losing 1-0. But then Pletcher beats Philippi, and in the wrestlebacks, Philippi ends up falling short. Meanwhile, Roman Bravo Young, despite a loss to Austin DeSanto by a score of 7-2. And weirdly enough, with this one, people were talking like RBY got screwed out of a takedown, and that made a huge difference here. I mean, I guess his strategy at the end is different if he does get the 2 points for it. But the fact that he got put on his back at the end and it was a 5-point match, I think you kind of have to give DeSanto a little bit more credit than he's gotten here. But then looking at the wrestlebacks and how RBY made it in, he ends up facing off against Philippi and beats him 4-3. So RBY makes it as an All-American as a 10 seed. Mickey Philippi as the 4 seed does not make it to the top 8. But he wasn't the highest seed not to make it. That was saved for 184. So now we go to 141. At this weight, this was the one where we had the most people who ended up falling well below their seed and the most people who ended up stepping up. So the guys who ended up stepping up, we had 9 seed Dom Demas from Oklahoma. We had the 13 seed Kyle Shoup from Lock Haven. And then we also had Chad Red at 16 from Nebraska. Red had a pretty rough start to the season, but came on really strong at the end of the year. But then the guys who ended up falling off, we had number 4 Josh Alber from UNI. Number 6, Mike Carr, who had a really bad Big Ten tournament as well. And then number 8, Cannon Store from Michigan. So we'll move on to 49. All right, at 149, there was just one guy who fell out and one guy who popped in. And we kind of saw that there was a potential for this just heading into the tournament based off of the duel out in Stillwater. But Pat Lugo started to come on strong at the end of the year. Meanwhile, King Gefeller, it sounds as though he had some sort of injury that he was dealing with, and that seems to be how the wrestling worked out. He ended up losing to Blees in his first round match. And Lugo was able to make his way in after falling to Micah Jordan in the quarterfinals, but really quick exit for King Gefeller, and good job from Pat Lugo to wrestle into the top 8 there. At 157, we had this was pretty similar to 125 in that it was the 8 and the 9 flipping. Actually, at 125 is the 6, not the 9, or not the 6, not the 8. Anyway, at 157, Pagdaleo from Arizona State ends up getting in as a 9 seed, while Humphreys falls off as the 8 seed. So Humphreys from Lehigh won his first round match, but then lost to Pagdaleo here. And the wrestlebacks ends up being unable to make it into the top 8. Let me see if we can find the match that he had there. So here we go. So that's Humphreys working his way in before falling to Deacon. But then Pagdaleo, I believe he lost to Pantaleo. Yeah, so actually no, Pagdaleo got in by beating Talib Rahmani of Pitt, and Humphreys ended up having to face Deacon, who was upset by Young of Iowa, Caleb Young. But at 165, this weight class was another one where it was just a single wrestler who ends up falling below their seed and one who ends up sliding in as a result. So the one who fell beneath their seed was Logan Massa. He fell to Bryce Steyert by a score of 2-1. Ends up getting a terrible draw after Makai Lewis defeats Alex Marinelli. So Massa has to face Marinelli in the consolations. Marinelli gets the win there. Flex is back at Massa, which is kind of funny and a bit of a response from last year's Big Tens when Massa did that with the Brands brothers. Massa was chirping him after. I think he was like trying to say that he had won 2 matches to nothing, or he'd won 2 previous matches. It was kind of pointless at that point. He just got kept off the stand. So not an All-American year for Logan Massa, surprisingly. And Bryce Steiert was able to make it in. At 174, we had 2 guys fall off and then 2 guys pop in. In this case, the 2 guys who fell off were 7 and 8, and the 2 guys who popped in were 9 and 10. So not a major shakeup from a seeding standpoint. But the 2 guys to get in are Mikey Labriola, the 10 seed, and Devin Skatska, the 9 seed. And then the 2 guys to fall out were Taylor Luan of UNI and then Jacob Smith, who was just moving down in weight to 74 from Oklahoma State. But Luan, again, kind of a bit of a rough draw here, had to face off against Mark Hall and wasn't able to make it through the wrestlebacks. And Smith ends up falling to Labriola in the 10-7 match. But Labriola was able to make his way back in. Then at 184, this is where we had the highest seed to fall and not make it to the stand, and also the lowest seed to make it to the stand. And those guys actually fought each other in the consolation bracket, so it ended up working out perfect in that way. But the 2 guys who did make it from much lower seeds, you have Dakota Gear from Oklahoma State, and you have Chip Ness from UNC. Chip Ness made it in by beating Shakur Rashid, won 8-6. Actually ended up making all the way to the semifinals before losing to Drew Foster. And Dakota Gear, I think he actually fell pretty early, but was able to do well in the wrestlebacks. Yeah, so he fell to Sammy Colbray, but then was able to make it in the wrestlebacks by beating the number 2 seed, Shakur Rashid, who was the biggest one not to make it to the stand, but Nick Reenan also was unable to make it to the stand as well. So let's see if we got the matches. Reenan fell pretty quickly. I'm pretty sure he was dealing with some injuries going into this tournament. And when I was doing my picks, I also picked against him, with that being my understanding, and his results seem to say the same. And then as far as Shakur Rashid goes, he ended up losing here to Dakota Gear by a score of 4-2. Moving on to 197. This was another weight class where there were 2 guys out, 2 guys in. 7 and 8 were out at 197, so Ayala of Virginia and Traxler of Stanford were out. Honus of Cornell was in, and then Hockett from Fresno State was in as well. And that's impressive for Hockett as a 16 seed to make his way in. And he just got roughed up by Bo Nickel in the round of 16, but was able to wrestle back really well. But then to go back to the consolation bracket just to find those guys. So Hockett had to beat Perry from Buffalo, Jacobson of Lehigh, and then Brunner to make it to the All-American rounds. And then Honus had to beat Laird, who beat a guy who I actually thought was going to All-American, and Jacob Woodley, but Woodley didn't have a great tournament. But then Honus beat him, and then he beat Lane of Cal Poly, who had a win over Jacob Warner in the main draw and got to the quarterfinals. But unfortunately for Lane, the 2 losses, both in the quarters and then the loss to Honus, took him out of contention for All-American status, despite a pretty good year from him. And then moving on to the final weight class, heavyweight. This one we had Mason Paris at number 5 end up falling out, although by having Gunning of Buffalo out of the bracket, it made Mason Paris' time a whole lot tougher, as he got Sam Stoll in the first round, which is a really tough match to have to deal with an All-American. We also saw an All-American have to face off against a high seed at 165 when Joe Smith went against Alex Marinelli. Marinelli was losing that match 4-1 early on, but ended up coming back to win. But Mason Paris' case, he wasn't able to beat the lower-ranked former All-American and Sam Stoll, so Stoll won that match 8-5. But then in the wrestlebacks, Paris wasn't able to make it through. Thomas of Pitt also had a solid start early, but then lost to Stencil of Central Michigan, who was one of the guys who is 9 and below who made it to the stand. So Stencil is an All-American, and then Yusuf Hamida for the University of Maryland is also an All-American. And Hamida beat Stoll in the wrestlebacks to get there. So Sam Stoll made it tough on one of them, but also gave Hamida the opportunity to make it in. And just to go to that consolation bracket real quick. So Hamida 7-4 over Stoll to make it in. And then Stencil pinned Mason Paris to make it in.